Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the gallery's Victorian windows. I stood in the middle of what my mother-in-law had called that worthless old junk shop, surrounded by paintings, sculptures, and artifacts that my grandfather-in-law, James Montgomery, had collected over his 6 decades of world travel. "At least the building is structurally sound," my husband Tom said, trying to be optimistic as he examined the old hardwood floors. "Maybe we could sell it to a developer?" I ran my hand along an ornate frame, feeling the intricate carving beneath years of dust. "Not yet," I said quietly. "Your grandfather left this to us for a reason. Let's at least try to understand what he built here." My name is Emma Chen Montgomery, and 2 weeks ago, I inherited what the family considered the booby prize in James Montgomery's will. While my brother-in-law Richard received the family mansion and investment portfolio, and my sister-in-law got the vacation properties, I was left the Montgomery Gallery of Fine Arts, a 3-story Victorian building in a small town that had seen better days. A fitting inheritance for the art history major, my mother-in-law Margaret had sneered at the will, reading, "Worthless art for someone with a worthless degree." What they didn't know was that during the last year of his life, I was the only one who regularly visited James. While the rest of the family was busy managing their portfolios and social calendars, I spent afternoons with him in this gallery, listening to stories about his collections. But he never gave me a complete inventory, never fully explained what treasures might be hidden among what looked like a lifetime of eclectic collecting. Grandpa James had an eye for the unusual, I told Tom as we explored the dusty rooms. He never collected the obvious pieces. He used to say that true value isn't always visible at first glance. Tom nodded, but I could tell he was distracted, probably thinking about the $1 million property portfolio his brother had inherited. The Montgomery family fortune had been built on real estate and smart investments, not art. To them, this gallery was just an old man's expensive hobby. I pulled out my laptop and a small notebook I'd used to record James's stories during our visits. "Let's start with the main gallery," I said, beginning to catalog the collection. My art history background and museum internships had taught me the importance of proper documentation. The first floor contained mainly paintings, landscapes, portraits, and abstract works from various periods. Many were good. Some were excellent, but nothing seemed extraordinary at first glance. But then I noticed something about a small landscape in a corner. "Tom, look at this signature," I called him over. "The style, the brushwork. This looks like an early Monet, but it's signed M. Claude. Is that important?" Monet's full name was Oscar Claude Monet. He sometimes signed early works as Claude. I carefully examined the canvas backing, the age of the frame. My hands started to tremble. This could be an unknown early work. We need an expert to verify it. Tom looked more interested now. "How much will that be worth?" "If it's authentic?" "Millions." I was already taking detailed photographs. But more importantly, if Grandpa James had one piece like this, there might be more. Tom finished, finally understanding. We spent the next week doing a preliminary inventory. The more I looked, the more I found pieces that needed expert evaluation. A small bronze sculpture that bore striking similarities to Rodin's early work. A collection of Chinese pottery that looked far older than the Ming Dynasty replicas they were labeled as. But it was what we found in the 3rd floor storage room that changed everything. "These trunks haven't been opened in decades," Tom said, helping me move a heavy wooden chest. The label read, "North Africa, 1962. Inside, wrapped in old blankets, we found a collection of ancient Egyptian artifacts. My hands shook as I unwrapped them carefully. "These look like they're from the New Kingdom period," I whispered. "But that's impossible. These should be in a museum." Tom was reading through some old papers found in the trunk. "Here's a letter from 1962, something about an archaeological expedition Grandpa James funded. Legal export papers, permissions from the Egyptian government." He didn't just collect art, I realized. He was a serious antiquities collector, but why didn't he ever display these pieces properly? The answer came 3 days later when Dr. Marcus Way, one of the world's leading art experts, arrived to examine the collection. I'd sent him photographs of just a few pieces, not mentioning their source. His response had been immediate and intense. The moment he walked into the gallery, his professional demeanor cracked. "My God," he whispered, moving from piece to piece. "Do you understand what you have here?" I watched him examine the small landscape I'd noticed. His hands were shaking as he used his specialized light to examine the paint and canvas. "This is an unknown early Monet," he confirmed. "Probably from his time in Normandy, before Impression, Sunrise. But that's just the beginning." He moved to the bronze sculpture. "This Rodin is also authentic, one of his studies for the thinker. And these pottery pieces," he carefully lifted one of the Chinese vases, "Ming Dynasty, but not replicas. Originals." My head was spinning. How much would you estimate the collection is worth?" Dr. Wei looked around the gallery, making rapid calculations. "Just from what I've seen on the first floor, at least $100 million. If those Egyptian artifacts you mentioned are authentic, possibly much more." At that moment, my phone buzzed. A message from Richard. "Family meeting tomorrow. Discussing a developer's offer for your gallery property. Don't be difficult about this." I showed the message to Tom, who had sunk into a chair, still processing the revelation about his grandfather's collection. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I looked around at the treasures James had spent a lifetime collecting, thinking about our conversations, about his belief in looking beyond the obvious. "First," I said, "we're going to document and authenticate everything properly. Then we're going to turn this gallery into what your grandfather always dreamed it could be." Dr. Wei was already making calls to his colleagues, arranging for a full evaluation team. "This will shake the art world," he said excitedly. "A previously unknown private collection of this magnitude." As I watched the experts begin their work, I thought about tomorrow's family meeting, about Margaret's sneers and Richard's condescension, about how they dismissed this inheritance as worthless, just as they dismissed my art history degree. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about proving others wrong, it's about proving yourself right. And sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who knows how to truly see them. The Montgomery family's private conference room hadn't changed since I first entered it 10 years ago as Tom's fiancé. The same oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, silently judging every decision made beneath them. Richard sat at the head of the table, Grandpa James' old spot, while Margaret held court at his right hand. "We've received an offer from Platinum Development Group," Richard announced without preamble. $5 million for the gallery property. Given the location and condition, it's more than generous. I placed my folder on the mahogany table, taking my time. "That is generous," I agreed, "but I'm afraid we'll have to decline." Margaret's perfectly manicured nails drummed against the table. "Don't be foolish, Emma. That building is eating up money in maintenance costs. The art inside isn't worth a fraction of this offer." "Actually," I said, opening my folder, "about that art, I began laying out photographs and preliminary authentication reports. Dr. Marcus Wei and his team have spent the past week evaluating the collection. Would you like to know what they found?" Richard barely glanced at the documents. "Some old paintings and dusty antiques. What's your point?" "My point is that the worthless collection you've been mocking includes an unknown early Monet, an original Rodin study, authentic Ming Dynasty pottery, and a legally exported collection of New Kingdom Egyptian artifacts." I slid the preliminary valuation across the table. "Current estimated value, approximately $300 million, and they're still cataloging the second floor." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret's face had gone pale. Richard picked up the valuation with trembling hands. That's impossible," he stammered. "Actually," a new voice said from the doorway, "it's probably conservative." Dr. Wei entered, followed by his colleague Dr. Sarah Chen from the National Gallery. "We just finished our preliminary assessment of the second floor collections. The Japanese prints alone are worth $20 million. I watched as the family's expressions shifted from dismissal to disbelief to dawning comprehension. Tom, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Grandpa James didn't just leave us a building," he said. "He left us a legacy, one that only Emma was patient enough to understand." Dr. Chen stepped forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "The Montgomery Collection, as we're proposing to call it, represents one of the most significant private art collections to emerge in decades. The range, the quality, the historical significance." She spread out more photographs on the table. "These pieces tell the story of human creativity across centuries and continents. We're offering our full support to establish this as a proper museum," Dr. Wei added. The art world is already buzzing with the news. Several major institutions have expressed interest in collaboration. Richard's face had turned an interesting shade of red. Now wait just a minute. If this collection is worth that much, surely the family should have a say in its disposition. Perhaps we should consider selling to private collectors. Actually, I interrupted, pulling out another document. Grandpa James was very clear about that. I read from his private letter to me, found in the gallery's safe. This collection was built not just for its monetary value, but for the stories it tells about human achievement. It belongs to the world, not to private vaults. Emma will understand this. Margaret's lips thinned. You knew about this all along. Those afternoons you spent with James. I knew he was a brilliant collector, I said. But even I didn't understand the full scope until now. What I did understand was his vision, to create something lasting, something that would enrich people's lives. Over the next few hours, we outlined our plans for the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts. The Victorian building would be carefully restored, its original features preserved while being upgraded to modern museum standards. The surrounding area, far from being dying, would be revitalized by the museum's presence. 6 months later, I stood in the restored main gallery, watching as the final preparations were made for our grand opening. The space had been transformed. State-of-the-art security and climate control systems protected the priceless artifacts. Each piece had been carefully researched, its story ready to be shared with the world. The town had changed too. New cafes and shops had opened nearby. Hotels were being built to accommodate the expected tourists. Property values, including Richard's precious real estate holdings, had skyrocketed. Mrs. Chen Montgomery, a young intern, approached with a tablet. The Times wants to know if you'll comment on the Montgomery collection being named one of the most important art discoveries of the decade. Before I could answer, I heard familiar footsteps. Margaret stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable but determined. I want to help, she said quietly. With the museum. I've been taking some art history classes online, and she gestured helplessly at the magnificence around us. I want to understand what James saw, what you see. I smiled, remembering all those dismissive comments about my worthless degree. We're starting a docent training program. Would you like to join? The grand opening attracted art lovers and critics from around the world. Richard and his developer friends watched in amazement as thousands of visitors lined up to see the collection. Tom stood proudly by my side as I gave interviews about his grandfather's legacy. But my favorite moment came later, during a special evening tour for local students. A teenage girl stood transfixed before the early Monet, her eyes wide with wonder. How did he see it? She asked me. How did your grandfather-in-law know these pieces were special when everyone else missed them? I thought about James's words during our afternoon talks. True value isn't in what everyone else sees, Emma. It's in having the patience to look deeper, to understand the stories behind things. He knew how to look beyond the surface, I told her. And he trusted that someday someone else would too. The Montgomery Museum became more than just a collection of valuable art. It became a center for education, offering programs for students of all ages. The conservation department attracted experts from around the world. The research library, named in James's honor, became a vital resource for art historians. Richard eventually came around, especially after realizing how the museum's presence had transformed his real estate investments. He even donated one of those stern ancestral portraits to our historical collection, though I suspect that was more about tax benefits than reconciliation. Margaret threw herself into her docent training with surprising enthusiasm. Watching her explain the significance of Ming Dynasty pottery to visitors, her face alight with genuine interest, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't about proving others wrong. It's about opening their eyes to what they've been missing. Last week, I found a letter while organizing James' papers, written shortly before his death. It read, "Dear Emma, by now you've discovered what I've always known. That value isn't just in what can be bought and sold, but in what can be understood and shared. This collection needed someone who could see beyond price tags to the human stories behind each piece. Thank you for being that person. Love, Grandpa James." As I write this from my office overlooking the restored gallery, watching visitors discover their own connections to art and history, I'm reminded that inheritance isn't just about what we receive. It's about what we choose to do with it. The art world still buzzes about the miraculous Montgomery discovery, but I know there was no miracle. There was just an old man who spent his life collecting stories in physical form, and a granddaughter-in-law who took the time to understand why. Sometimes the most valuable things are dismissed as worthless by those too impatient to look deeper. And sometimes the person they underestimate turns out to be the one who understands the true worth of things all along. The museum continues to grow, each new day bringing fresh discoveries and connections. In the end, we didn't just preserve a collection. We fulfilled a vision, one that transformed not just a family's understanding of value, but an entire community's appreciation of art and history. And that, as Grandpa James would say, is worth more than all the real estate in the world.